Hello everyone and welcome to GeoTab's online training. Thanks for joining us today for Tuesday's talk. This is Carrie Carter and today's session is on scorecards, how to use them and how to evaluate your drivers with the 5 pillars. Angie is with me today and she's going to walk us through some samples and some best practices. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Angie.
Just a quick little overview. I'm talking about scorecards. And when we hear about scorecards, we always think about driving behavior, but there are definitely other ways that we can score our drivers and fleets. Looking at productivity, maybe lowering the productivity. Looking at engine health risks, so the check engine light and other fault codes that we're seeing on the vehicles. Compliance, so violations that are happening with the drivers and how we can score the drivers and get that down. To get started, I'm going to start off with the productivity pillar. So when we think about productivity, one scorecard that we've kind of come up with here is late starts. So starting off the day late can throw off the entire day and the entire route for that driver. Some customers may be missed. Some customers may be taken, but then extremely, extremely late. Identifying those drivers. Feedback again. Sorry, everybody here, technical difficulties today. Identifying those drivers not starting on time is one way of helping to ensure this doesn't happen. So you'll be able to start having those conversations and stressing the importance of being on time. This here is an example of a scorecard that we've created here looking at those late starts. So I'm just going to give you a quick little overview of what we've done. This is actually looking at the base time card report and just making a couple of tweaks here and there and looking at incidents of how many times the fleet has been early, late, or how many vehicles. So we can actually set our start time. You can see over here highlighted in the yellow where it says 12 p.m. We can switch that to say 7 a.m., 9 a.m., whatever you want to switch it to. And then when you actually change that time, all of this will be recalculated depending on what vehicles and what category they fall into. So the first category is looking at if they're on time or early. So if they're coming in before noon or 7 a.m., which is great, or right on time. If they're less than 5 minutes late, if they're 5 to 15 minutes late, 15 to 30 minutes late, and over 30 minutes late. So looking at this particular fleet here, and I think this is our own internal one, so it's not an actual fleet's data, but it gives you a really good idea on how it works. So we're looking at the pie chart here. We can see that this fleet, majority of the fleet, was actually over 30 minutes late for this time period. And you can run it for whichever time period you want, daily, weekly, monthly, all the options that we have in the system. So this is just one way to score on productivity. There's definitely other ways that we can do it. Some ways that I've seen other resellers do it is looking at windshield time versus customer time. So how much time are they actually spending on the road when they should be spending it with the actual customer itself? So you can do it like every other scorecard where you can compare the drivers to each other, compare it to the overall average, and then start looking at maybe a utilization scorecard. So let's look at maybe engine on time for the month. Compare that to the rest of the fleet. Is this vehicle actually being utilized? You know, let's bring that productivity back up again. Maybe it doesn't really need to be in there. Are these drivers, can they be used somewhere else or something along those lines? So I wanted to talk about the safety pillar next. This is probably the number one scorecard that we see used a lot, is around the safety aspect. So a safety-focused scorecard can quickly identify your riskiest drivers or your best drivers, and we often tend to lean on the riskiest, but you can absolutely lean towards who's your best drivers out there, who's the ones that are getting, you know, the perfect scores out of 100. But absolutely you can go by your riskiest drivers, and we always tend to go by the riskiest drivers because we want to be proactive. We want to be able to take the actions before something bad happens. It can help reduce your overall risk and claims, and we've actually seen with one fleet what was the amount again, Carrie? It was 33%, I think, on the claims.
33% is where it started, and it dropped drastically.
33% is where it started on the claims, and it dropped drastically. Thanks, Carrie. So talking about safety, now this one is actually looking at, I don't know, most of you have seen our basic driver scorecard in our software. And it looks at, there's no rules or anything in the report, it just looks at some standard information from the risk management report. So I've taken that and I've made it a little bit better, if you will. I don't want to say better, but I've changed it a little bit. Basically what I've done is I've got our standard speed bands. So we've got our 3 speed bands that are in the system, which can be found in the system settings in the database. So you can adjust those at any time. And then we're looking at idling, and for this report in particular, we were looking at idling greater than 5 minutes. So we're actually just getting an incident count. We're taking that events per 100 miles, which I like to do with most scorecards, and you don't have to, but it's a good way to really find out who is the riskiest in the categories. So we've taken that by our events per 100 miles, and we've simply just created a scoring criteria in this report. And this is in the same in the next one I'm going to cover, but basically every 0.5 events per 100 miles, the score of 100 goes down by 1 point. It's pretty simple. We've turned it into 5 because we found out of 100 some fleets didn't like it, but it's very easily flexible. So it doesn't have to be out of 5, it can be out of 25, it can be out of 50. You can do whatever you like. So basically what we've done here is here's all the vehicles, here's their speed score, here's their idle score, but then we've got a line for their average fleet score. So where do they fall in comparison to the rest of the fleet? So it's really nice to show that information, and then we can start to be proactive and reach out to those outliers and find out what's going on and how we can help change their behavior. This is another example of the scorecard that we've got, and this is looking at actual rules put into the system. So this is built off our risk management report, which is a big one that I like to use for scorecards because it gives us the total distance that they've driven. So we can actually look at the events per 100 miles again, and we can actually put in 6 rules, which is fantastic. So let's say you want to look at your harsh acceleration, braking, cornering, but maybe you also want to look at possible accidents, or if they're driving with their seatbelt off, or if they're speeding either over a maximum speed of, say, 65, or if they're actually speeding over the posted road speed. You can add up to 6 rules, which is great. We've got 2 ways of showing the data. The first one on the upper left here is looking at the overall fleet and how everybody's doing. So it's a high level, putting them into those risk categories. So you can see we've got our score out of 5. So a score from 0 to 1 means they're a very high risk. So we've made it so that 5 means it's a perfect, great score. 0 meaning they're not doing good at all, and you need to really target those people. Down below, we actually broke it down by vehicle, and this particular screenshot is showing the best drivers in the fleet, but you could absolutely just change some sorting to show the worst drivers of the fleet and take your action there. So I did kind of cover how it works. I've got it kind of bullet pointed here. So events per 100 miles is how I like to do it. The score starts at 100 for 0 events. Each 0.05 event, sorry, I think I said 0.5 before, 0.05 event increment for your events per 100 miles, the score goes down by 1 point. So the total score is actually the individual rule scores multiplied by their weight percentage. Now I didn't show you a screenshot of the weight percentage, but basically you can add a weighting to each rule. So let's say speeding is a huge thing for your fleet and you want to really target that as the #1 risk factor. So let's say make that a 30 or 40% weighting and make everything else, 10s or 5s. So when we start to look at the individual score for speeding, we've taken into factor that weighting, and that will affect their overall score. So we can see exactly where they're having issues. So that's how our scorecard works, the one that I've created, but there are definitely other ideas that are out there, and I've seen other resellers do. So You can absolutely rate each driver compared to the overall fleet average, which you saw me do on that, that basic one. Compare drivers to fleet goals. So I've seen some fleets actually have made their own categories and what's acceptable, what is not acceptable, what is kind of middle line, and you can create a scorecard to reflect and compare against those values. Another really cool way that we've done it, and I've seen other resellers do, is to put a cost to it. So how much is this risky behavior actually costing your fleet? So we've seen where you could put a cost to wear and tear on tires from harsh braking and cornering. You could put a cost to if they're speeding over 65, which we've seen in some industry research. There, you can definitely put a dollar amount to that. So there's a whole spin there with putting the ROI to it. You can even change how you create your score. So I like to look at the events per 100 miles and do my scoring criteria with the increments. But I've seen some other people do where they take their events per 100 miles, they multiply that by 100. Then what they'll do is they'll subtract that value that they get from 100 to see what the score is out of 100. I know I said 100 a few too many times there, but so let's say your events per 100 miles, you multiply that by 100, you get 83. So you have 17 left as your overall score. So it's another way of just looking at the data. And you don't have to use the events per 100 miles. The reason why we do that is, let's say you have someone that broke the speeding rule 50 times, and then you have somebody else who broke it 5 times. By looking at just the incident count, you could assume that the person who broke it 50 times is the worst driver. But let's now take in distance into consideration. So let's say that driver that broke it 50 times, he's driven actually 3,000 miles, whereas the guy who's broken it 5 times has only driven 50 miles. So now when you start to take that distance into consideration, that guy who only had 5, he's actually the worst driver because he didn't drive that much and he broke it that many times. Hope that makes sense. If there's any questions, we'll go over that at the end, but that's kind of why we tend to do the events per 100 miles. But you can absolutely just look at the incident count if you want to, or you can use other mathematical calculations as well. Okay, so now let's take a look at the fleet pillar. So when we're talking about fleet, we're more so thinking about the vehicles themselves, the engine health, all of that. So oftentimes a driver does not pay attention when that check engine light comes on. But as we all know, what happens if this goes unchecked? You know, what does a check engine light mean and how can ignoring it affect the vehicle? How about identifying the drivers that are neglecting having anything done? How often are they neglecting that? So we can actually measure that data, and this is one example of how we've been able to do that. Now this is simply just looking at certain diagnostic codes, which is basically just the general vehicle warning light or the low priority warning light. And what we're really doing here is running it for last month. You could run it for last week as well if you want. We've basically just taken account of how many days the vehicle had the check engine light for that time period. And then we've got a percentage of the time frame. So you can see vehicle 16 for last month, 96% of the time that he had his vehicle running, it had a check engine light on, and he didn't do anything about it. So it's a great way to not just manage against the driver behavior here. We kind of are, but we're more so looking at the engine health. So vehicle 16, we want to reach out to whoever's in charge of 16 and say, you got to come into the shop. We need to get back. You can run your main exactly using that engine light and go from there. There are definitely others that you can. I've learned of how many fault codes that the vehicle has. I've seen some fleets that actually have hand-picked fault codes because they know the ones that they really want to know about, and they've created a report on that. So looking at the incident count, how many fault codes overall, and the vehicle with the highest fault codes, we need to get that one brought in as well. So there's lots of different ways that we can take a look at the health of the engines just by running those engine reports, taking a look at the data, and really just kind of playing around and seeing how we can measure it. So when we're talking about compliance here, my main focus here on compliance was hours of service violations, and they can be costly. So we did some research into the FMCSA website, and we found this interesting paragraph here. Trucking companies and passenger carriers that allow drivers to exceed driving limits by more than 3 hours could be fined $11,000 per offense, and the drivers themselves could face civil penalties of up to $2,750 for each offense. So when we read that, we thought, okay, well, we could probably, based on that report for hours of service, and we broke it by just the driving violations. So we've got an incident count of the actual violations and how much that's costing not only the driver, but the company as well. So you can see those dollar amounts can get pretty high. So this is, I think, a great way to measure the hours of service compliance here by looking at the cost, which is obviously a big driver for a lot of companies. Okay, the final pillar here is expandability. What I touched on here, and expandability is our newest pillar that we talk about, and it's really talking about the expandability of the device. So I know that was a really, really quick one. I apologize if I was going too fast. I may leave it to Carrie, and if there's any questions, let me know.
Please reach out to any of us if you have any questions, and we can certainly help you from there. And with that, I am going to say thank you so much for joining us. So I hope we will see you next week. And with that, we'll sign off, and thanks again.
Thank you, everyone.